In just 47 seconds, $3.2 million in progressive donor funds vanished from the Democratic Party's shared database. Zohran Mamdani didn't adjust his tie or wait for the microphones. He pulled out his phone, opened his Twitter app, and began typing. Cameras leaned forward. The entire Democratic establishment froze. What did New York's newly elected mayor expose that made the most powerful party leaders in America stop returning his calls and start plotting his political destruction? At 2:17 p.m. on November 18, 2025, 13 days after his historic mayoral victory, Zohran Mamdani walked into Federal Plaza like a community organizer who had memorized every broken promise the Democratic Party had made to working families. His hands were steady as he carried a manila folder marked Housing Justice Files, his eyes locked onto the federal agents waiting in Conference Room B. This wasn't a congratulatory meeting. This was an interrogation. The 34-year-old Democratic socialist had done the unthinkable. He'd won New York City's mayoral election by the largest margin in decades, crushing both Andrew Cuomo's comeback attempt and the Republican establishment. But victory had come with a price. His platform of rent freezes, free public transit, and universal child care had energized millions of young voters while terrifying the party's biggest donors. Now, just 2 weeks before taking office, those same donors wanted answers. The meeting had been called by Senator Chuck Schumer's chief of staff. Officially, it was about coordination between federal and local housing initiatives. Unofficially, everyone in the room knew it was an intervention. The Democratic Party's power brokers had watched Mamdani's insurgent campaign with growing horror. His membership in the Democratic Socialists of America wasn't just ideological decoration. It was a direct threat to the corporate-friendly wing of the party that controlled billions in campaign contributions. "Congratulations on your victory, Mr. Mayor-elect," said Rebecca Morrison, Schumer's deputy chief of staff, her voice carrying the warmth of a January morning in Buffalo. She sat across from Mamdani like a career politician carved from pure establishment marble. Her briefing folder remained unopened, her bottle of Fiji water untouched. Behind her, 2 men in expensive suits whispered into phones, their voices just quiet enough to avoid being recorded. Mamdani's response was ice-cold precision. "Thank you. I assume this meeting isn't about congratulations." Morrison's smile flickered for exactly 0.7 seconds. "We're here to discuss your transition priorities, specifically your housing proposals and how they align with federal Democratic initiatives." What she didn't say hung in the air like tear gas. The party leadership had spent weeks in panic mode since Mamdani's victory. His campaign promises weren't just progressive talking points. They were detailed policy proposals with specific funding mechanisms that threatened to expose decades of Democratic complicity with real estate interests. His plan to freeze rents on 1 million apartments would cost landlords billions. His proposal for city-owned grocery stores would undercut corporate food chains. His universal child care program would eliminate the need for expensive private daycare that employed thousands of party donors. "I'd like to discuss my housing files," Mamdani said, opening his manila folder with surgical precision. Inside were 47 pages of financial records, email exchanges, and donation reports that told a story the Democratic establishment desperately wanted to keep buried. Morrison's face drained of color as Mamdani's fingers traced the first document. It was a printout from the Federal Election Commission database, showing a $3.2 million transfer from the Progressive Housing Coalition to a shell organization called New York Future Solutions, LLC. The transfer had happened 3 days after Mamdani announced his mayoral candidacy. The receiving organization had no employees, no office, and no public mission statement. It existed solely to funnel progressive donor money away from candidates like Mamdani. "This is interesting," Mamdani continued, his voice maintaining the calm intensity of a tenant organizer who had cornered a slumlord. "Progressive donors think they're funding housing justice initiatives. Instead, their money disappears into consulting contracts for firms that oppose everything they support." The room fell silent except for the nervous shuffling of papers. Morrison reached for her water bottle, her knuckles white against the plastic. "I'm not familiar with those particular transfers." "Of course not." Mamdani flipped to page 2. "But I think you'll recognize this email thread. The printout showed an exchange between Morrison's personal Gmail account and David Rothstein, managing partner at Meridian Strategies, one of New York's most powerful real estate lobbying firms. The subject line read, "Mamdani problem. Urgent response need." The emails were dated October 15th, 3 weeks before the election, when polls showed Mamdani pulling ahead. Morrison's jaw clenched as Mamdani began reading aloud. Quote, "David, we need to discuss containment strategies for the Queen's Socialist. His rent freeze proposal could crater property values citywide. My sources suggest he has internal polling showing a 12-point lead. We need to move fast." End quote. "That's taken out of context," Morrison snapped, her professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. "We discuss all candidates and their potential policy impacts." Mamdani smiled, the expression of a chess player who had been setting up this moment for months. "Context is exactly what I'm here to provide." He flipped to page 17. "Here's the wire transfer authorization from Meridian Strategies to Democratic Unity Fund for $750,000. Dated October 6, 1 day after your email." Coincidence? The two men behind Morrison had stopped whispering. Their phones were forgotten as they leaned forward, trying to read the documents upside down. One of them, a pale 30-something in a Hermes tie, was visibly sweating, despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Morrison's voice became a steel blade wrapped in velvet. "Mr. Mamdani, I think you're misunderstanding normal political coordination." Am I? Mamdani's question hung in the air as he flipped to page 23. "Then explain this recorded phone call transcript." The document was a verbatim transcription of a November 2nd conference call, 3 days before the election between Morrison, Rothstein, and Alexandra Chen, deputy mayor for economic development under the current Adams administration. The conversation had been legally recorded under New York's one-party consent law by someone whose identity was redacted, but whose access to the call had clearly been authorized. Mamdani began reading in a voice that could cut glass. Quote, "If Mamdani wins, we're looking at a complete restructuring of the housing market. His people aren't just progressive, they're anti-business. We need contingency plans." Chen responds, "What kind of contingencies?" Morrison, "Federal oversight, housing regulations, EPA reviews. We can slow roll everything for 2 years until the next mayoral cycle." End quote. Morrison's face had gone from pale to gray. This conversation never took place. Mamdani pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. The screen showed a paused audio file. "Coordination call, Nov 2, final, dat MP3. Would you like me to play the recording?" The silence in the room was so complete that the building's ventilation system sounded like a hurricane. Morrison's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The man in the Hermes tie was now openly staring at the audio file like it might explode. "Or," Mamdani continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "would you prefer to discuss the real reason for this meeting?" Morrison's hands trembled as she finally opened her briefing folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a resignation letter template with her name already typed in the signature line. Below it was a non-disclosure agreement and a consulting contract with a private equity firm in Miami. The message was clear: take the money and disappear, or face complete exposure of the coordination scheme. "I see you've already prepared your exit strategy," Mamdani observed. "Impressive efficiency." The mayor-elect's phone buzzed with a text notification. The preview showed a message from his press secretary. "NY Times ready to publish. Waiting for your authorization." Attached was a draft headline. "Secret recordings expose Democratic plot to sabotage progressive mayor-elect's housing agenda." Morrison's voice cracked as she spoke. "What do you want?" Mamdani closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. For months his campaign had been treated as a long-shot insurgency that might win a few progressive districts, but could never threaten the real power centers of New York politics. The Democratic establishment had watched his primary victory with bemused condescension, assuming that Andrew Cuomo's name recognition and unlimited funding would easily overwhelm the amateur from Astoria. They had been catastrophically wrong. Mamdani's message of housing affordability and economic justice had resonated with a coalition of young voters, working families, and longtime New Yorkers who had been priced out of their own neighborhoods. His victory margin of 23 points wasn't just a political earthquake, it was a realignment that threatened to expose decades of cozy relationships between Democratic leaders and the real estate industry that had made housing unaffordable for millions. "I want transparency," Mamdani said. "I want every dollar of that $3.2 million tracked and returned to legitimate progressive organizations. I want a public accounting of every real estate lobbying contact your office has had in the past 2 years. And I want a guarantee that federal agencies will cooperate with my administration's housing initiatives instead of sabotaging them." Morrison's laugh was bitter and brittle. "And if we refuse?" Mamdani's thumb hovered over the send button on his phone screen. The draft tweet was already composed. "In 60 seconds, I'm releasing secret recordings that prove how Democratic leaders conspired with real estate lobbyists to undermine housing justice. The swamp includes our own party." Thread 1. Then at 2:47 p.m., exactly 30 minutes after this meeting was scheduled to end, those recordings become public. Along with the financial documents, the email threads, and the witness statements from 3 Democratic staffers who were willing to go on record about the coordination scheme. The man in the Hermes tie finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Jesus Christ, he's actually going to do it. Morrison's professional mask completely collapsed. "Do you understand what you're threatening to destroy? The entire Democratic fundraising apparatus in New York runs through these relationships. You'll crater our ability to compete against Republicans nationwide." Mamdani's response was the philosophical foundation that had driven him from community organizing to the mayor's office. "When we talk about my politics, I call myself a democratic socialist inspired by Dr. King, who said there has to be a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children. That includes taking on corruption wherever we find it, even in our own party." Morrison stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor like nails on concrete. "You're making a huge mistake. The party has ways of dealing with rogue actors."
Is that a threat?
Mamdani's voice remained steady, but his eyes had hardened to obsidian. "Because I should mention that this entire conversation has been recorded under New York state law, and I have witnesses outside this room who can verify the time, date, and participants." For the first time in the meeting, genuine fear crossed Morrison's face. She realized that Mamdani hadn't just stumbled into evidence of corruption. He had methodically documented a conspiracy that could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations. The young mayor-elect hadn't come to this meeting to negotiate. He had come to deliver an ultimatum. 47 seconds, Mamdani announced, glancing at his phone timer. "That's how long you have to decide whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem." Morrison's finger hovered over her phone screen, where a speed dial contact, labeled Crisis Management, wait to be called. Behind her, the 2 men exchanged glances that conveyed years of political strategy, condensed into a single moment of absolute terror. They understood what Mamdani represented, not just a progressive politician, but a generational shift that could permanently alter the power dynamics of American urban politics. The timer reached 0. Mamdani pressed send. Within minutes, his Twitter thread was exploding across social media. The NYC DSA chapter, which had provided crucial organizing support for his campaign, began amplifying the revelations with the hashtag Democratic Accountability. Progressive journalists who had been investigating similar schemes in other cities suddenly had a smoking gun that connected local corruption to national Democratic strategy. The recordings were devastating. Morrison's voice, captured in crystal clear audio, discussing containment strategies for the Queen's Socialist, Rothstein's casual mention of leverage points in federal housing agencies, Chen's detailed explanation of how environmental reviews could be used to delay affordable housing projects indefinitely. By 3:15 p.m., Housing Justice Files was trending nationally. Cable news networks were scrambling to book Mamdani for emergency interviews. Democratic leaders in Washington were frantically calling each other, trying to assess how far the scandal might spread. Congressional progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders immediately defended Mamdani, praising his transparency and calling for investigations into similar schemes in other cities. Moderate Democrats tried to distance themselves from the exposed coordination network, while quietly wondering how many of their own financial relationships might survive scrutiny. The real estate industry's response was swift and predictable. Trade association statements condemned politically motivated attacks on legitimate business advocacy. Lobbying firms began scrubbing their websites of references to Democratic consulting contracts. Property management companies started preparing for the possibility that Mamdani's rent freeze proposal might actually become reality. But the most dramatic reaction came from Morrison herself. At 4:23 p.m., she published a statement on Twitter that sent shockwaves through political circles. "I resign my position effective immediately. Mr. Mamdani's allegations require a full investigation. I will cooperate completely with any federal or state inquiry. The people of New York deserve better than what these recordings reveal." Her resignation letter to Senator Schumer was even more explosive. She detailed a systematic effort by Democratic leadership to coordinate with real estate interests in undermining progressive candidates. She named names, provided dates, and attached financial documents that traced money flows from lobbying firms to party organizations to anti-progressive campaign activities. Within 72 hours, federal prosecutors had opened a preliminary investigation. The FBI was reviewing financial records. Ethics complaints were filed against 3 sitting Congress members, and Zohran Mamdani had transformed from mayor-elect to the most powerful progressive voice in American politics. The lesson was as clear as it was revolutionary. Sometimes the greatest threat to corruption isn't Republican opposition, it's Democratic transparency. Mamdani had proven that progressive politics could win not by moderating their positions, but by exposing the systems that make moderation seem like the only option. Standing outside Federal Plaza that evening, addressing a crowd of supporters and reporters, Mamdani delivered the line that would define his mayoralty. "We didn't just win an election, we exposed a system, and now we're going to replace it." The crowd erupted. The cameras rolled. And in Washington, Democratic leaders realized that the revolution they had spent decades trying to co-opt had finally found a leader willing to burn down their comfortable compromises. The age of progressive politics as performance art was over. The age of progressive politics as governing power had begun. If this story revealed the truth about how progressive movements get sabotaged from within their own parties, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this with anyone who needs to understand how real change happens, not through compromise with corruption, but through exposure and accountability. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if you had recordings this explosive? The next battle for American democracy might depend on your answer. Disclaimer: this dramatized story explores themes of political accountability and progressive organizing, using fictional scenarios inspired by real political dynamics. All specific events, conversations, and financial details are created for educational and commentary purposes. This content is not intended to make factual claims about any real individuals or organizations, but rather to examine how transparency and documentation can challenge entrenched political systems.